Welcome to lesson number 3 in our series on the 7 deadly sins. Today we look at 2 of the deadly sins, avarice and envy. And the reason I'm doing that and looking at 2 today, and so the lesson will be a slightly bit longer, is twofold. One is that in the scheduling that we have for the number of weeks in the semester where I'm doing this in person as well, to do the 7 deadly sins and the 7 cardinal virtues, we've got to combine a couple of weeks together. But the other reason is because avarice, which we might call greed, might be another word you'll hear me use, or envy, which would be biblically might be called covetousness as well. Those are 2 that kind of go along the same type of lines as that excessive desire, usually related to stuff. Lesson 4 will be on lust, and that's kind of that excessive desire as well, usually towards people, although lust can be for other things, and we'll look at that more fully in the next lesson. But I'm putting these two together, this greed and covetousness, because they kind of, although all of them are interrelated to some degree, these kind of go together a little bit, and you'll kind of see some overlap, I think, especially when we talk about the dangers and the antidotes for avarice or greed and envy or covetousness. So let me start by asking you a question. Seemingly simple one, but I think requires a little bit of reflection. How much is enough? How much stuff, be it money or possessions or status, is enough? It's a good question to start off with and to have in the back of your mind as we go through this lesson on avarice or greed, to ask that question, how much is enough? Because we know that there are certain necessities that we all need and that we have needed for all time, food, shelter, and clothing in particular. But even with these things, how much is enough? How much do we really need? How big a house do we really need? How much food do we really need? What kinds of clothing would satisfy the basic needs that we have to clothe ourselves and be able to go about in society? And then what about cars? We might need a car, but what kind of car do we need? Or maybe vacations, cell phones, these other types of things. Most, if not many, if not most of us, have more now than what we grew up with. And one thing that is true for everybody is that what used to be considered luxuries are now considered as necessities. And just a quick example related to technology is that when my wife and I got married in 1990, everything was a landline. There were no cell phone plans. There was no internet. So we paid a monthly fee for a basic Bell South in our region, Bell South landline. And that was it. Well, then the internet came along, and pretty soon what looked like a luxury became a necessity. And then the broadband came along, so instead of dial-up, that was more. But you came to need that, especially as the kids were in school and whatnot, and the needs there. Then cell phones came along, but then what kind of cell phone? And then the smartphones came along. And a lot of these things that even early on I might have gotten and got the most basic things, over the course of time got more and more advanced, and I used it more and more. And it became more of a necessity even in my work than just a plain luxury. And so that communication cost, if you will, is very different from what it used to be in there. But even having said that, how much of that do we really need? There's a reason, after all, that whenever a new iPhone is released, that in these major cities there are lines literally around the block. And it's not because they need to make a phone call or they need to take a picture. There's some new, just to say you have it, there's some new feature, whether it's really important or not, or needed or not, that people just feel like they have to have, when the old phone really is doing everything that they need for it to do. So we are told, though, in our society about these things that we need. You need to have this in order to have the quality of life that you deserve. And that quality of life in societal terms, and all the messages that we are bombarded with is determined or measured in large measure by how much stuff you have. Or if not the amount of stuff, then the price or the quality of the stuff that you have. After all, we can buy a shirt from Walmart that will provide what we need. But when we put a little logo on that thing, or that's either there or that's on the back tack, then we know that the price goes up significantly. One example kind of shows us of that when we're looking at housing is that since 1950, the average number of people in a household has decreased from an average of 3.7 to 3.1. But in that time, the average size of a house has increased significantly. So really, on average, you kind of need one less room than you used to, but in that time, the average square footage has increased by several hundred feet, to where the square footage of a house in 2022, the average square footage of a house was 2,299 square feet, and that was the average. 100 years ago, the average size of a family was even greater, and the houses were even smaller. And while there are a lot of factors that have gone into this change, it is also clear that our expectations have risen. What we consider acceptable has risen. In our day and time, we need refrigeration. But you can buy a refrigerator now that has cameras in it. And it can program it to check for certain foods. And if the foods aren't there, then the refrigerator can order the thing for you online and put it in your cart wherever it is that you shop that does that type of delivery. Well, the reality is I can do the same thing in 10 seconds by opening my refrigerator, saying, oh, we need this, we need milk, we need butter, we need all these types of things, and I can write it down on a little notepad and do that in 10 seconds instead of spending an extra several $100 or $1,000 for to get the computer or get my refrigerator to do that for me. Those are just a couple of examples that are kind of more realistic and sillier, in my mind at least, than some other things. How much do we really need? How much is enough? When I was in my younger years, and my first appointment out of seminary was in Tupelo, Mississippi, and my aunt and uncle, one of my aunts and uncles, lived there. And my Uncle Robin and I were talking about the changes that had taken place over the last few years. The Berlin Wall had fallen in 1989, and then the Soviet Union had fallen in 1992. And we were talking about those competing ideologies politically and economically of capitalism and communism, and this almost 75-year-old battle that took place between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, representing these different ideologies. And he was a big reader, and he had read a lot up on all the different things. And I loved his take on capitalism versus communism, especially in terms of economics. He said capitalism is flawed because it depends upon our greed, and it caters to our greed. The call is always to have more, which means you have to spend more. And more is never enough. And indeed, our very economic health depends upon a certain amount of growth, a certain percentage of growth per year. And where does that come? It comes from increased manufacturing, spending, and servicing of goods. And so basically that greed is built into our economic system in order to maintain that health and continue to grow year by year. For it to continue to grow, there's more that has to be manufactured and more that has to be consumed. And so greed is built in and even a necessary part. And then he went on, he says, communism is flawed, though. He said, because people are greedy. And no matter who comes up with these great ideas, when it comes to these type of things, people are always going to try to accumulate more. People are always going to measure, societies in general especially, are going to measure their success or their worth based on what they have. There will always be more who gain more at the expense of others. And so he said one depends upon greed and is flawed, and the other is flawed because people are greedy and they're going to try to do that anyway. Now he went on to say, and I agree with him on this, that capitalism is the best of those systems, but it is far from perfect, especially when we look at it from a Christian standpoint, because it encourages our dissatisfaction. Our society builds in a sense of dissatisfaction. You always have to have more. You have to have more. You have to have better, and you have to have that better quality. Our very society encourages us to be discontented with what we have, and to see more and better as the keys to a truly successful life. It's that old adage of keeping up with the Joneses and not even realizing that while you're trying to keep up with the Joneses are trying to keep up with you. So I'm going to go back to this question one more time. How much is enough? If you are consumed with avarice, and that's what's driving your life, if that desire is what is driving your thoughts and your attitudes and your behaviors, then the attitude of one consumed with avarice or greed is this: enough is a little bit more than what I have now. If I could only have that better car, that nicer home, live in a better neighborhood, have a better job, then I would have all that I need. Have you ever said that before? If I only just had that, and we'll talk more about this with envy as well, if I only had that, then everything would be fine. But what we discover when we're consumed by that type of attitude is that enough is never really enough. There's always more. There's always something else on that horizon when we are looking to these things to provide that fulfillment and meaning. And so I want to remember, before we go specifically into looking at some scriptures and those specific dangers, I wanted to remember two things. And it really kind of goes across all of these 7 deadly sins, but kind of talk about it in relationship to avarice and then envy. One is to remind you that there is a reason why these 7 particular sins were classified this way, because of their specific dangers involved, attitudes and behaviors. I think primarily it's because they lead us to commit other sins out of these uncontrolled desires. And they have destructive consequences not only for our own souls, but for others as well. A second thing to remember is that these desires are nothing new. They were classified, back in the 300s, they were classified as the passions, as I talked about in lesson number 1. Later on, then, Pope Gregory would term them the 7 deadly sins. But we see throughout Scripture that Scripture addresses each one of these things. So they've been around forever. Avarice and greed and envy have all been around since the very beginning. So I want to look at a few scriptures in this point. One is from Luke 12, verses 15 to 21. Luke 12, 15 to 21. Jesus is giving a parable, and he says, "Take care. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." Then he told them a parable. The land of a rich man produced abundantly. And he thought to himself, "What should I do? For I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grains and my goods. And I will say to myself, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you. And the things you have prepared, whose will they be?" So it is with those who store treasures for themselves, but are not rich toward God. Now, this parable is commonly called the parable of the rich fool. because it's the parable about a man who has more than he can use. He sees himself as the sole reason for his wealth, so there's some pride involved in that as well. He sees himself also, here's the key, as the only one who should enjoy these types of things. He sees himself as solely responsible, so he's going to be the one to enjoy it. He's going to go ahead, he's going to retire, he's going to build bigger barns to house what he has, and he's going to keep it all to himself and enjoy the abundancy of what he has. But of course, the parable is that his life is going to end, and so who's going to be able to enjoy that? Because he's so consumed about taking care of himself that he is not looking at the needs of others. And so notice what Jesus says is how he finishes this parable. Such is the case for those who store up possessions on them for themselves on this earth, but are not rich toward God. And so I don't think, by the way, that Jesus is saying it's wrong to have possessions. The sin is in a couple of things. One, it's engaging it's in determining or trying to determine the quality of your life by those possessions, by what you have, using them as the measuring stick for what's a, quote, successful life on this earth. And then the other part, though, is the key part. It's about not being rich toward God. In other words, the question is, how do we use the material resources that God has blessed us with? Are we generous only to ourselves and for ourselves, or do we work to support the work of God on this earth? Are we generous in what we do, or do we store up everything for ourselves and miserly and we hoard it? This bumper sticker reminds me this passage reminds me of a bumper sticker that I saw in the 1980s and 90s that was quite popular. I haven't seen it in quite a while, but I remember it. And the bumper sticker said, "He who dies with the most toys wins." And that was kind of the attitude. Get everything that you can, grab everything that you can, and if whatever you have when you die, then that's the measure of how successful you were in this life. But around that time, I was talking with an older preacher friend who remarked on that bumper sticker. He and I were out, and he saw it. And he said, "Chris, I have been in ministry for 45 years, and I've done literally hundreds of funerals. And the one thing that I've never seen is a U-Haul being pulled behind a hearse. No matter how much we try, we can't take it with us." There's an old preacher story about a man who was determined to take it with him, and so he liquidated all of his assets. He had the money converted into bars of gold, and he lined his coffin with those bars of gold. He goes up to the pearly gates ready to impress all of heaven with his cleverness and with all that he had accumulated on this earth. And as he proudly shows the gold bars there at the pearly gates, St. Peter looks at him and says, "You brought pavement?" There's that old joke, about the streets of gold. He says, "You brought pavement." It's a reminder that what we value so much on this earth has little value or is of no value when it comes to heaven. What we have on this earth is temporary, and it can't bring us the happiness or the security that is that driving force in our lives, no matter how much we try. And somebody consumed by the sin of avarice is looking to that to bring fulfillment. Then we look at 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 6 through 10, and Paul is talking and instructing Timothy. He says, "Of course there is great gain in godliness combined with contentment. For we brought nothing into the world so that we can take nothing out of it. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with these. But those who want to be rich fall into temptation and are trapped by many senseless and harmless desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, and in their eagerness to be rich, some have wandered away from the faith and have pierced themselves with many pains." So this passage by Paul is one that we've heard at least parts of it, but even those parts I think sometimes we've heard wrong. Notice what Paul does not say that is often attributed to him. Paul does not say money is the root of all evil. That's how it's normally put out there. And you can find quote books and things online where they quote that. He does not say money is the root of all evil. He says is that the love of money is the root and the source of all kinds of evil. And because of that love of money, many people have been led astray. Not everybody, but many people have been led astray because they allowed that love of money, that unbridled desire, to lead them down dark and destructive paths. That distinction is so important. Again, it's not necessarily how much you have, but it's what you do with what you have. It's the priority that you place upon the accumulation. It is what you or who you look to as the source of your ultimate security. It's in who or what you trust to depend upon to give you meaning and purpose and peace and joy and security in this world. He says it's not money or it's not possessions. It's the love of these things. It's that misplaced, disordered love that leads people to wander away from God, to put their desire for wealth above God, their desire for that security above God. And that is what leads them down many painful roads and dark and destructive paths. And then from 1 John, the first letter of John, chapter 3, verses 11 through 17. For this is the message you have heard from the beginning, that we should love one another. We must not be like Cain, who was from the evil one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own deeds were evil and his brothers were righteous. Do not be astonished, brothers and sisters, that the world hates you. We know that we have passed from death to life because we love our brothers and sisters. Whoever does not love abides in death. All who hate a brother or sister are murderers, and you know that murderers do not have eternal life abiding in them. We know love by this, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brothers and sisters. How does God's love abide in anyone who has the world's goods and sees a brother or sister in need and yet refuses help? Now, that scripture talks more about that importance of loving, but he gives that kind of negative example. He says, if we have the world's goods at our store, if we have all these things at our store, and we see somebody in need and we fail to help, then we don't have love. And that love of God does not abide in us. And so the presence of Christ does not abide in us. What do you do with what you have been given? Where do you see the source of those things? So these scriptures all combined together give us some of these different aspects of avarice that I've already alluded to. The first is the love of the possessions themselves, be it money or something else. It's that unbridled desire, that uncontrolled desire of greed, in which we demonstrate a love for what we have or what we want to have, and we'll talk more about that with envy, a desire for what we have instead of the love of God who gives us all these things and wants us to use them to honor him and to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ and to build up his kingdom. Two aspects of greed are seen in that parable when the man places his trust in his grain, in this harvest, instead of God. Seeing his value, measuring his value, and seeing his security in what's in that barn instead of what is in his heart. The other part of it, though, that Jesus alludes to about not being rich towards God, it's hoarding what he has, refusal to use that grain in any fashion to help anybody else, not even trying to sell it, but trying to hoard it all for himself. He wants to make sure he has enough, so he hoards what he has instead of giving to others. He's rich towards himself, but not rich toward God. You see, he sees his resources, and this is kind of a difference again between economic systems and the way that God works. He sees his resources as from a standpoint of scarcity and lack of trust. I don't know what's going to come, so I've got to hoard what I have, versus an attitude of abundance, that God will provide what we need. We need to be good managers of it, but God will provide what we need. We need to be rich toward God and not just rich toward ourselves. That love of money, that love of those things leads us to be miserly in hoarding and holding on to what we have, and in failure to help the people that God sends us to. As we think about these different scriptures, one basic definition of avarice is just the desire for more and more, and the hoarding of what we have but do not need. Another definition, part of that definition is that avarice places the security in this life on what we have. So the more we have, the more secure we will be. It's the desire for and trusting in the stuff of this world instead of God that leads us to that sin of avarice. It puts the priority on the possessions instead of God. The amount of stuff, the accumulation, the pursuit of that determines our status and that worth. Not only how we think others view us, but more importantly, how we view ourselves. One of the things that I've noticed over the years is that there are only two basic worldviews. I talked about two main competing economic systems, but when it comes to how we view life, how we view our lives, how we just determine to live our lives, there are really only two basic worldviews. One is that is centered on God, and one that is centered on self. One is godly and the other is secular. One says there's nothing more than what we see in this world, so eat, drink, and be merry, which was a popular idea and thought out of Greek philosophy at the time. Even if there's an understanding of some measure of responsibility for your neighbor, it really even still comes from your own enlightened self-interest, if you will. That motivates what's best for you instead of a concern for the other person. And even if we do something that looks generous, we do it to enhance our own status, our own worth, or our own security in other ways. We might help somebody along the way and might even use that money towards what's a good thing, but it's all in service to us. It's what enhances us and what enables us in the future to acquire more. The godly viewpoint, however, recognizes that all we have comes from God, and we trust in God to provide what we need. We pray for it, by the way, in the Lord's Prayer. Give us this day our daily bread. So, Lord, when we pray that, we say, Lord, give us today what we need. And then tomorrow we'll pray that prayer, and we trust you'll give us tomorrow what we need. And maybe one way to kind of sum it up about trusting in our possessions instead of trusting in God is to ask ourselves this question. Do we control our possessions, or do our possessions control us? Another danger of avarice is that it puts the emphasis on our cravings and our desires. We see stories over the years, and it continues to this day, where someone's killed over a brand name jacket or a pair of shoes or a car or a burglary or those sorts of things. We've seen on a less severe scale, but still pretty pitiful, where adults got into fistfights over that last phone that was available before it went on back order, or shopping for a kid's Christmas gift. One of my favorite little stories along these lines comes from a Christian animated series popular when my kids were little called Veggie Tales. And then the Veggie Tales takes some common Bible stories, kind of puts them in a silly context, but it retains the essential meaning, and to try to help present the basic message and the gospel message to kids. And one called The Toy That Saved Christmas. The hot toy for that year is called Buzzsaw Louie. He has an actual buzzsaw for his hands, so you can do carpentry and other things, and they can make things with Buzzsaw Louie. The commercial for the toy around Christmas time says you need to get Buzzsaw Louie, and then they end the advertisement as saying, because Billy has more toys than you. And it shows, the next scene shows kids running to their parents and saying, I need this toy because it's got a buzzsaw and everybody's going to have it, and also because Billy has more toys than me. And one of the kids goes, well, who's Billy? And the kid goes, well, I don't know, but he has more toys than me. In other words, I don't even know Billy, but as long as Billy has more toys than me, that's not acceptable, because I've got to have the most. I've got to have the latest. I've got to have everything. And we laugh about that message when we see it acted out in a silly cartoon animated series with kids, but that's how we act so often. Do we have our possessions? Do we control our possessions, or do our possessions control us? Are we more consumed with our cravings and our desires, and as long as we want it, then it must be okay? Again, I'll talk more about that with envy. Or am I being responsible with what God has given to me? Am I seeing all of these things and justifying them by what I think I deserve, and by the thought that if I can just have this other item, then that will finally fulfill and will finally satisfy my cravings and my longings. When the truth of the matter is that enough is never really enough. So what are then some remedies? What are some remedies or antidotes for greed? The first that comes to mind is gratitude. It's looking at what you have and being thankful for what you have instead of focusing on what you don't have and letting that be a source of discontent. A sense of gratitude puts the emphasis back on God's blessings, the abundance of God's blessings, and being thankful for what God has given to us instead of having the attitude of the world that encourages us to see what we have or even who we are as less than. And then in order to be adequate, we have to have more. Gratitude reframes our understanding about what we have and the proper use of all that God has given to us and entrusted to us for our time upon this earth. Another antidote, another remedy for greed is to determine to be generous. It's generosity. That generosity, by the way, is not only in our financial resources, but it's how we spend our time. It's how we spend our mental and our spiritual energies, where those go. That generosity may manifest itself in support for the church or charitable organizations. It may be for helping somebody in need. That generosity beyond material resources may be taking time to make a phone call to a friend or going and visiting, maybe fixing a meal for somebody who is sick. The generosity is in seeing the resources that we have as blessings that come from God that ultimately don't belong to us, and then using them and then trusting that God will provide what we need for each day, and then using these resources in service to God as we help others in Christ's name. Generosity recognizes that God, for most of us, has provided far more than what we need, and He will continue to provide what we need. So we don't have to worry about whether or not we will have enough. Generosity comes when we believe what we pray in the Lord's Prayer. Give us this day our daily bread. We trust that as God has provided what we need for this day, God will provide what we need for tomorrow. And tomorrow we will trust that God will provide for them and for the next day. God will provide. God has never let us down. I saw a great way of thinking about being generous. And it totally reframes what we have and who gave it to us. When looking at the material resources you have, whether they're financial, whether it's money in the bank, whether it's time, whether it's other material possessions, and trying to reflect upon and pray about how we use those things, don't ask, how much of what is mine am I going to give back to God? That's how we usually frame it. I have all this stuff, how much am I going to give back to God? Instead, ask this question: how much of what belongs to God am I going to keep for my own use? And how much then of what already belongs to God am I going to give back then? Not how much of what is mine am I going to give to God, but how much of what is God's am I going to hold on to for my basic needs. Because you see, the reality is it all belongs to God anyway. God promises to provide. When we have that kind of attitude towards the stuff in this world, we move beyond allowing greed to control what we do. And we are thankful for what we have, and we are determined to be generous with what we have. Instead of saying, how much of what is mine am I going to give back to God, and seeing that tithe, that standard of 10%, as us being exceedingly generous because we're giving 10% back to God, ask the question, how much of what is God's am I going to keep? And realizing that even in asking for that 10%, God allows us to keep 90% of what He has given to us, and to use that other 10 for the work of His kingdom upon this earth as we serve Him through His church, through other organizations, and through our help and need one another. I don't know about you, but if somebody gives me $1 and says you can keep 90 cents of it, I think that's a pretty good deal. So let's move on to envy. You'll see there's some overlap, as I said, but there's some differences as well. So let me start this portion of it by asking you this question. Think about something you have wanted badly. It might have been a new gadget. It might have been a new car, a new house. It might have been a vacation. It might have been a job. It might have been an event that somebody attended that you really wanted to attend. And ask yourself the question, is it bad? Is there anything wrong with wanting to have those things? And you don't have to respond in your head automatically, although you may want to pause the video and kind of think about that. What's something that I've looked at and I've said to myself, man, it'd be nice to have that, or I would love to be able to go there. I'd love to be able to do that. I picked out just a few of what is almost an infinite number of possibilities that can reflect, if we're not careful, the sin of envy. I want you to hold on to that question. Is it wrong to want to see something and think it would be nice to have that? And I want us to think about that as I read these different scriptures. I made mention at the beginning of the lesson that another word for envy that we see in the Bible would be not only envy, which is in Scripture, but also covetousness. It's that desire for what someone else has. And we're going to talk about what is maybe not wrong with wishing or thinking it would be nice to have something, and yet how that moves into a sin and even a deadly sin of envy or covetousness. In Exodus 20:17 and in Deuteronomy 5:21, you may not be aware that the Ten Commandments are found in two different places. In Exodus 20:17 and in Deuteronomy 5:21, it says this: "You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, male or female slave, ox, donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor." So one of the things I think which is evident, but want to point out, is that it makes mention about you shall not covet your neighbor's house. In biblical terms, in Old Testament terms, house referred, and it goes on and talks about some other types of things that were considered a man's possessions. And in that day and time, the wife and the fact that there were slaves were considered part of those possessions. But the house is a larger frame, not only a particular dwelling place, but also having to do with the totality of a man's family and possessions. So house is not only a dwelling place, but it's really looking at the totality of what somebody has and wishing that and coveting that. In Old Testament terms, it was prohibited covetousness was prohibited because to deprive a person of his land, a man of his land, was to deprive him of his God-given inheritance. And I do use the word man intentionally because women in those days had very few rights. Every Israelite, you see, was considered an heir of that descendant of Abraham, an heir of God's promise. And part of that promise was land. So to covet what somebody else had was to disregard what God had given to you and to be consumed by what somebody else had instead of what little you might have. And so that house is all of those type of things. I also want to look at envy and covetousness, and this one kind of goes along the same line with lust, which we'll look at more next lesson, but I include it in envy because it has to do with that desire, and not only that desire that David has with Bathsheba, but also kind of the subsequent things that happen. It happened late one afternoon when I'm reading from 2 Samuel 11, 2-5. It happened late one afternoon, and remember, the Israelites are off at war, and David is back at his house. David rose from his couch and was walking about on the roof of the king's house. That he saw from the roof a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. David sent someone to inquire about the woman, and it was reported, "This is Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite." So David sent messengers to get her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Now she was purifying herself after her period. Then she returned to her house. The woman conceived, and she sent and told David, "I am pregnant." Now David sees Bathsheba, and he desires her. And throughout history, and even some of my growing up, this was almost displayed as being some sort of, almost in some sort of romantic terms, because they do have a child and he eventually marries her. And this story, as I made mention, could be used in talking about lust. But, and the reality, though, is that for all those romantic notions that have been put over the years about this as love, really what this was sexual assault. David was king, and he saw Bathsheba, and he desired her. Her desires, remember, did not matter because she was a woman, and especially because he was king. The fact that he eventually takes her into his own house and marries her does not diminish what he's done. The sin of envy, you see, leads him to commit the sin of adultery and also murder. And so that sin that he has in coveting another man's wife is what it was. He has lustful thoughts for sure, but in coveting another man's wife, going against that commandment, he covets, he commits adultery, and he murders. And so he commits a variety of things. What we see is that sin of envy leads to paths that violate other commandments and commit other sins as well. I want to jump ahead now to Romans 13, verses 8 through 10, and Paul says, "Owe no one anything except to love one another. For the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. The commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this you should love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfilling of a law." So when we look down the line, of course, one of the antidotes to envy is that love of God and that love of neighbor. Paul demonstrates that love is opposite of envy, as well as opposite of all of the thou shalt not commandments, and it's opposite of all these deadly sins. When we live by that law of love, then we will avoid these different deadly sins. So this one kind of gives us a clue. Paul reminds the early church of those commandments that still have force in the early church and in the Christian faith as well. And he gives us some clues as to some antidotes, some practices of heart and mind and word and deed to combat the sin of envy. If we look at James chapter 4, verses 1 through 3, he says this: "Those conflicts and disputes among you, where do they come from? Do they not come from your cravings that are at war within you? You want something and do not have it, so you commit murder. And you covet something and cannot attain it, so you engage in disputes and conflicts. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly, in order to spend what you get on your pleasures." Now, I think James is really clicking into some different things here, and you may even want to rewind and listen to that again, or keep a pause and read it again. James 4, 1 through 3. I think James lays out here so directly what the other scriptures talk about in a little more general ways. Covetousness, you see, that desire for something, it inhibits our worship and praise of God. It turns the focus again, as with other sins, back on ourselves instead of God. It divides our loyalties between God and that which our desire. It separates us from also, not only from God, but then also from our neighbor, because we covet, we are envious of what another person has, and we desire to have what they have, and we think if we just had what they had, then everything would be okay. So I'm going to talk about the dangers of envy, but before I do that, I want to say a brief word about what envy is not. Envy is not simply wanting something or desiring something. It's okay to want things. It's okay to look at something somebody else has and go, "Man, that looks kind of nice." Or, "Boy, it'd be nice to have that. Boy, what a fancy house," or what a nice car, what a cool trip that they went on, or what a cool concert that they were able to attend. There are a lot of things that I think it would be nice to have, but I'm not envious of those things because I don't have them, and I'm not envious of the people who have them. I just think it might be nice to do or something to have one day. But it doesn't prevent me, and here's the key, wanting something or noticing that something is nice and thinking it'd be nice to have that is not necessarily envious. What is envious is wanting what somebody else has, letting that desire control you, and letting it disrupt your worship of God and interfere with your relationship for that other person. It's allowing those desires to dominate your thoughts and your actions and your attitudes. Envy is putting an unnecessary value, usually an unnecessarily or false higher value, upon something that you want but don't have or cannot have, and letting that interrupt your relationships and your words and thoughts. So there are four kind of overarching dangers of envy. One we've kind of gotten at. It's dissatisfaction. We talked about this with avarice, with greed. It's dissatisfaction with what God has given you. The attitude of envy says, and of avarice too, as we kind of go along that, says, what you've given me, Lord, isn't enough. I want more. Or it's not the right thing. You didn't give me the things that I necessarily want. I want more, or I want what that person over there has. Can you hear that difference? It's that dissatisfaction with what God has given to you, and an unnecessary fixation on what somebody else has. The second danger of envy is that it measures success and it measures blessings, whether you are blessed, based on material things as opposed to spiritual or blessings or the relationships that we have. It says that these temporary things that Jesus says moth or rust are going to destroy are more valuable than the relationships that we have with other people, and most especially that relationship with God. The third danger is that it goes into that, and we'll kind of continue along that line, is it disrupts the relationship with that other person because it objectifies that person based on what they have versus based determining that relationship and seeing that person as a person of inherent worth, sacred and priceless worth, somebody created and loved by God. See, envy is not so much thinking it would be nice to have something, but it's allowing that desire to mess up your relationship. And it does damage to your own heart as well. It replaces a joy for that other person. Well, good for them that they have, that they got that promotion, or good for them that they were able to do this or that. It replaces the joy or happiness that somebody else might be having, or that something good happened to them, and seeing them only in terms of that item and relating them only in terms of what they have. It's seeing them or what they have as only that other person only as an object to fulfill what it is you want, versus seeing them as people of sacred worth. You're going to see again, all these things are interrelated, kind of these overtones when it comes to lust as well, but we're holding on to envy right now. The fourth danger of envy is that it leads us to a sense that somehow we have been cheated out of something that we deserve. And then by extension, the person who has that thing that we desire probably just didn't deserve it. They didn't really earn it. They don't deserve it like I do. They got it by cheating, or somebody favored them unnecessarily. And if we had just gotten what belonged to us, then we would have that thing. And they did not, because we deserve it. We deserve whatever we get, but they don't deserve those things. I've referenced in previous lessons Dr. Roberta Bondi, who was a seminary professor of mine at Candler School of Theology at Emory University back in the 90s. And Dr. Bondi wrote a wonderful book that talks about some of these things called To Love as God Loves. I highly recommend it. And in that book, she talks about this. She makes this statement. Envy makes us see others through a haze made up of our own desire for power, our resentment that our life has not been as easy as another's, our sense of inadequacy next to another person's apparent perfections, a touch of humiliation, and a straightforward desire for what another person has that a secret part of us wishes that we had. Whew. You may want to pause and rewind that one again. She's getting at all these things, isn't she? When we focus on what another person has, and our desire to have that is something that we covet, we are inhibited from loving that other person. we somehow see that person as more than us, whether we think they deserve it or not. We see ourselves as less than in the world's eyes and in our own. And that relationship with God and that relationship with our neighbor is disrupted and can be destroyed. And if not dealt with, this uncontrolled desire eats away with us until we are consumed by what it is we don't have. Our concern for others and our concern for God disappears. All that is important is that which we covet. So, what are some of the antidotes to envy, remedies? One is the same as avarice, and it's gratitude. I'm not going to go back over that again, but if you're thankful for what you have, then you don't worry about what another person has. And that leads to kind of the second antidote, which is an attitude that determines to celebrate what another person has, that they're able to enjoy that particular item or enjoy that promotion or whatever it is. It's because you see, if we have gratitude for what we have and we recognize that what we have is God's blessings, then we can celebrate and we can truly say for somebody else, I'm glad for you that this thing happened. We like it when good things happen to us. Let's rejoice when good things happen to one another. In 1 Corinthians 12, when Paul's talking about the body of Christ, he says, when one member suffers, all suffer. When one rejoices, all rejoice. We rejoice in the good things and the joys of other people as well. The good things in other people's lives brings us joy as well, and vice versa. We are able to think about that other person and feel good for them instead of thinking only about ourselves. Celebrating and being happy for another person moves the focus from just on us to other people. A third antidote to envy is, I kind of talked about this with avarice as well, but I waited till envy to talk about it, is recognizing the difference between needs and wants. And I go back to that question for avarice, but it works for envy too. How much is enough? And what is it that you use to determine your worth and value in this world? And so God promises to provide what we need. So do we recognize? And an antidote to envy is recognizing that our wants and needs are not the same thing. Another aspect of this difference comes in recognizing that there might be something we want that we desire that's not really good for us. There's some things that I've wanted in my life that I realized weren't really good for me to have. And while I had that desire for them, that desire did not lead to joy. And even obtaining that thing on occasion led to more problems, not to joy. There's that old adage that says, be careful what you wish for because you just might get it. Covetousness says that sin of envy thinks that if I just have that item, if I just have that person, whatever it is, if I just achieve this thing, then everything will be okay. And what we discover is that some of the greatest challenges and difficulties and down points of our life is when we get exactly what it is that we wanted to have. Fundamentally, the antidote to avarice and to envy, and really to all the deadly sins, is trusting first and foremost in God. Trusting that God looks out for us. Trusting that, as Jesus says in Matthew 6 in the Sermon on the Mount, God knows what we need and He's going to provide for what we need. That if He provides for the lilies of the field and the sparrows, how much more will He provide for us? Remembering and trusting that God is always there for us and that God will provide what we need, not only in material resources, but the spiritual resources, provide for us what we need to live fully for Him in this life. So my encouragement at the end of this lesson is to take some time today or in the coming days to practice gratitude. Maybe even write down what it is, all that you have, all the blessings you've had, material and otherwise. Be grateful for what you have, the people that God has put into your life. Pledge to use the resources you have for God's glory, to reorient your thinking, to be generous toward God. Celebrate God's blessings in your life and also celebrate the blessings that other people enjoy. Look at what you have and say, is this something I really need, or is it just something I want? And in an overarching all of it, pledge to honor God in all that you do. Well, thank you for hanging in with me in this lesson. It's the longest lesson that we will have in the midst of the whole thing. And so I hope that there's something that has been of value to you. I invite you to join me for the next lesson, which will be on the sin of lust. Thank you, and God bless you, and have a wonderful day.